Okay, today we're going to be talking about the Korean War. So this is a conflict that's contained within the Cold War. And we will get into the details of how all that fits in. So these are your key terms. Most of them are fairly self-explanatory, and the individuals will become apparent as we go through, so I'm not going to spend much time on that today. And so, again, timer's going to start writing these bullet points down, and then after 2 minutes, I'll begin explaining. Do not press pause. Keep writing even as I'm explaining. Okay, so most of what we're going to, or at least as we've talked about yesterday, and we're going to start off today, this is all happening after World War II. Now, in China, what you do have is before World War II, they were involved in a civil war where you had a communist faction in China fighting against what we would consider to be a democratic faction. But World War II caused them to essentially stop fighting, join back together so that they could defeat the Japanese. So they were one of our allies in Asia during that time. Once World War II is done, instead of realizing, hey, we had a common interest, we should work together, they go right back to their civil war. And without getting into the minutia of their civil war, the main part is that the communists win the civil war in China, led by Mao Zedong, who is pictured here. And it cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives for this civil war to come to an end. And the way that we still see it playing out in modern day politics is that China as a whole is a communist country. The people who wanted a democratic government in China had to flee to an island off the coast of China that is now today Taiwan. But again, that's another story for another time. How this fits in the Cold War is the communist element. So the communist faction in China is supported by the Soviet Union. Because they're trying to spread communist ideals around the world, and they're trying to get other countries to follow their method of communism so that they will be allied with them, so that they have more power, more control around the globe. So obviously a country the size of China becoming communist is going to be a concern for the United States, in that after World War II, because of the containment policy, the Truman Doctrine, is that the United States is trying to stop the spread of communism around the globe. So yesterday we talked about how they were wanting to stop the spread in Europe. Now we're going to be talking about what takes place in Asia. So what this leads up to is, again, after World War II, what used to be Korea, which is a peninsula on in Eastern Asia, used to be a singular country. After World War II, it split in half along what's called the 38th parallel. It's not an exact straight line, as you can see in the map here, but it's pretty close. So along that line, there's North Korea, which is communist, and South Korea, which is democratic. And so after the war, they're split into those two factions. And at that point, the United States is fine with that. So they don't want China to spread any further. North Korea is contained. But then in 1950, right after the troops that had been stationed in South Korea for World War II were called back home, it's never immediate. It always takes a couple of years for everyone to finish what they're doing and then to be recalled back after a major war like that. So once the American troops are out of South Korea, that's when North Korea takes the initiative and they invade South Korea, wanting to make South Korea a communist nation, or unite North and South Korea into one communist Korea. So this is going to put President Truman in a bit of a bind, in that he's already stated that the job of the United States and its allies is to stop the spread of communism. So North Korea being communist, if it's invading South Korea, by the Truman Doctrine, the United States has to assist in some way to stop that spread. So what President Truman does here is that he does a bit of trickery, and instead of declaring war on North Korea with the United States, he goes to the UN and he asks our allies at the UN to pass a resolution at the United Nations, and that resolution is that all these countries are going to send troops to South Korea to fight against North Korea. So we talked about it yesterday, in the last lecture. The United States does not want to get into a direct conflict with the Soviet Union, and in this case, China. So what they're going to do is they're going to use other countries to help us fight. So we used our allies. So the United States, along with several other countries, which include countries in Southeast Asia and Japan and so on and so forth, they join up with us to do this fight. So it's not all on the Americans. All right, 2 minutes to start writing. I will begin explaining in 2 minutes. Again, please do not pause the video. Okay, so the actual war itself doesn't take a long time, but it is very, very significant. So the U.S. and its allies send their troops over to South Korea. And after an early push by North Koreans across the 38th parallel, the United States and its allies, led by General MacArthur, were able to push North Korea back across the 38th parallel, and actually fairly far past the 38th parallel, to where they look like they're going to be able to not only get things back to where they were, but actually defeat the North Koreans. This is where the problems begin arising. So General MacArthur wanted to go ahead and defeat the North Koreans, just sort of end them entirely and make all of Korea a democratic nation. But President Truman ordered him to back off, and this was for two reasons. First off was, once North Korea was pushed back, China decided that they were now going to send troops over. So before, China and the Soviet Union were supplying money and weapons to North Korea. But at this stage, China decides they're going to get involved in the fighting. So now this puts the United States in a bind, because now it could be seen as the United States actually fighting against a communist country. And then in the UN resolution that President Truman had gotten passed by their allies, was that all the United States was going to do was get North Korea back across, or the UN was going to get North Korea back across the 38th parallel. There was nothing in the agreement about essentially destroying North Korea. So because of this, General MacArthur publicly criticizes President Truman during a conflict. So that's not generally a good idea to do. So President Truman then decides to replace General MacArthur with another commander, and to actually carry out his vision, because the president is the commander-in-chief of all the military and has the power to do so. So with the Chinese backing the North Koreans, they were able to get back, North Korea is able to get back to that 38th parallel line, and then they got into a stalemate. So all of a sudden, nobody's moving either past that 38th parallel line. So this leads to a pause in the war with an armistice, meaning that they're going to lay their guns down. They're not saying that the war is over, but that they're going to stop fighting in order for negotiations for peace. And those negotiations for peace fell apart, but the conflict has never picked back up. But that's where it is today, is that North Korea and South Korea have never settled this conflict. Technically, they are still at war with each other. Technically, there's no peace treaty, nothing like that. So at any point in time, they could just resume fighting the Korean War. Even though the UN resolution is no longer standing, the United States supports South Korea, but we don't send troops over there regularly, even though we do have a couple of bases in the area. So the effects of this war, which is anytime you have a conflict of this nature, it's going to have lasting effects. Korea, though, the Korean War is known as the Forgotten War. It's not really explained. It's not a well-known conflict like, say, World War II is. There's not a bunch of people that analyze it and go over it and create documentaries about it. And part of that is because it was a war in which no ground was won or lost. So at the start of the war and where we're at now with the armistice, no one gained anything, and it just was a large loss of life, and destroying of some resources during the time of the fighting. So the North, after the armistice, remained allied with China and the Soviet Union. So that means that they're getting support from those countries because they're wanting to spread their communist ideals. And the South is still allied with the United States. What this leads to, and why this is very important, is because of the Korean War, the United States creates an Asian version of NATO. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization from the previous lesson, which is that this defensive alliance with other European countries to stop the spread of communism. That's what NATO is. Then you have SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which it's the same exact thing except it's in Asia. So any countries that are in the region of Asia or close to the continent of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, are going to ally together, those democratic nations, and that if, for instance, China decides to invade or are trying to turn other countries communist, that those allies, along with the United States, are going to step in and try and prevent the spread of communism. So this alliance, along with the Truman Doctrine, which is that the United States is going to help any democratic country stop the spread of communism or stop from being turned communist, is what's going to drive the United States into the Vietnam War, which is, from the United States standpoint, is going to be a more costly and a very long war that is going to change a lot of things within the United States. And that is all we have